The island of Okinawa looked insignificant on a map, but it sat like a dagger aimed at the heart of Japan. Commanders on both sides understood that whoever held Okinawa would control the air and sea approaches to the home islands, and that reality shaped decisions at the very highest levels. The next 3 months would feel less like a battle than like an experiment in national endurance, where strategy met brute force and civilians were forgotten until later. By early 1945, the Pacific War had become a series of brutal escalations designed to get closer to the Japanese mainland. Each island taken added airfields and bases, and each loss tightened the noose around Japan, as supply lines and morale forcing strategists to plan bigger and sharper operations. Okinawa was the logical next step, a stepping stone with the scale and geography to function as a forward base for any invasion of the home islands. For the Allied planners, the calculus seemed straightforward: seize Okinawa, prepare for invasion, and pressure Japan toward surrender. Yet the island presented a problem that numbers could not easily solve, because numbers do not measure human determination or the wild use of terrain. For defense, what awaited the invading force was a fortress turned inside out, with caves, ridges, and villages prepared to become instruments of mass killing. The Japanese defense strategy on Okinawa was deliberate, adaptive, and deadly by design, because Tokyo knew the end was near and chose to make any invasion pay an unbearable price. Instead of meeting the Americans on the beaches, Japanese commanders pulled back to a network of prepared positions across the island's interior, turning hills into strong points and towns into killing fields. This approach forced American troops into a grinding attrition fight that collapsed the expectation of a quick, decisive victory. The result was fighting that looked and felt like a slow-motion avalanche, with each ridge taken only after terrible exertion and heavy losses. Men advanced through fields of shrapnel and razor wire, then into villages where every house could conceal a sniper or an explosive charge. The casualty lists grew longer while progress crept forward, and the atmosphere on both sides hardened into a relentless tempo of survival attempts. There was nothing elegant about the combat on Okinawa, because modern industrial firepower met a defense that would trade territory for time without hesitation. Artillery barrages turned ridgelines into moonscapes, while flamethrowers and explosives flushed defenders from their caves in desperate, bloody exchanges. The landscape itself began to resemble the battle, mutilated and contorted to meet the needs of survival and destruction. One of the most terrifying new variables introduced to the battle was the kamikaze campaign, a tactic that used human pilots as guided missiles against Allied ships. Squadron after squadron of aircraft dove into decks and superstructures, turning steel and fire into a single moment of catastrophic consequence. Those attacks were not merely military actions. They were psychological weapons that made every day at sea a weighted risk and every ship a potential tomb for sailors and the crews that depended on them. Kamikaze strikes sank and crippled dozens of ships, but the human cost extended far beyond metal and timber, because each attack echoed a cultural willingness to sacrifice everything to delay defeat. For sailors who had already seen months of sea warfare, those dives felt like fate arriving early, and the naval crews adapted with engineering improvisations and hardened resolve. The images of burning carriers and downed planes would haunt military planners who would have to imagine even worse scenarios during a potential invasion of Japan itself. On land, the combat reached a level of brutality that modern audiences struggle to comprehend, because it was not only the armies clashing but entire societies colliding in primitive, destructive ways. Japanese defenders used caves and underground tunnels to surprise and resist, creating micro-fronts that dragged on for weeks and months. American forces responded with specialized units and new tactics. But mechanical advantage did not erase the horror and the human toll that accreted with every cleared position. There is an often untold dimension to Okinawa that has less to do with strategy and more to do with civilians trapped between two collapsing military machines. Okinawan families had lived on the island for generations, cultivating rice and fishing in peace, and suddenly found themselves in a struggle they did not choose. With battles moving into towns and the military issuing mixed instructions, civilian populations suffered from bombardment, starvation, and the moral terror of being used as shields by desperate defenders or being mistaken for combatants. Civilians were caught in a crossfire of ideology and logistics, and their suffering created a moral shadow over the entire operation that would outlast the war itself. Stories from survivors describe forced suicides, mass casualties in caves, and the agony of watching homes destroyed while relief came slowly or not at all. The human consequences of those months have continued to shape Okinawan identity, producing memorials, bitter memory, and political friction with central authorities decades later. On the American side, the battle became a test of logistics, technology, and psychological stamina because troops faced relentless terrain and an enemy who refused conventional defeat. Medical units were overwhelmed by the volume of wounded, and supply chains had to adapt to the conditions of a large-scale, prolonged island fight. The strain on troops and commanders altered planning assumptions about what an invasion of Japan would actually require in terms of men, material, and time. Commanders in Allied headquarters watched casualty reports with growing unease, because the calculations for an invasion of the Japanese home islands no longer seemed theoretical. Each day of fighting on Okinawa revealed new costs in lives and time, and those numbers accumulated into a political problem for leaders who had to justify the continuation of the war. The psychological effect of Okinawa fed directly into conversations in Washington about the alternatives and the acceptable limits of blood and treasure. Meanwhile, the Japanese leadership studied Okinawa as both failure and statement, because the battle showed how the homeland might be defended and how costly that defense could become for invaders. The tactics used on Okinawa were intended to maximize casualties and delay, to make any Allied invasion of the home islands an unattractive proposition. That logic was terrifyingly persuasive when projected onto the tens of millions of civilians who would populate the main islands and who would inevitably be swept up in total war. It was in this climate of dread and calculation that Okinawa began to influence the most consequential decision of the century, because leaders faced a binary choice between invasion and alternative measures. American planners estimated massive casualties for a mainland invasion, and political leaders felt the pressure of domestic expectation for a swift end to the war. The brutality of Okinawa made the hypothetical realities of blood and ruin less abstract and more immediate for those who would choose policy. The atomic bomb was not born solely from the logic of Okinawa, but the island's carnage accelerated thinking and made the bomb seem less monstrous compared to the projected cost of invasion decision. Makers could point to Okinawa and say that another campaign would mean cities flattened by conventional tactics and millions of casualties. This moral arithmetic, cold and politically expedient, tilted discussions toward a weapon that promised sudden decisive effect at a terrible price. But the relationship between Okinawa and the decision to use atomic bombs is more layered and ambiguous than a simple cause and effect story, because strategy, science, and politics all intertwined. Military leaders emphasized the tactical reasons to avoid invasion. Scientists remarked on the potential of new weapons, and politicians weighed public opinion against long-term consequences. Okinawa supplied visceral evidence that the cost of a traditional invasion might be intolerable, but it did not by itself decree the path that history ultimately took. Back on Okinawa, the fighting did not stop for theoretical debates, because the ground remained contested until the island finally fell, and then long after that in isolated pockets of resistance. Japanese stragglers and dedicated soldiers hid in caves and continued resistance, often to tragic ends. Because the ethos of fighting on became its own obligation, the island's final tally of dead, wounded, and displaced would grow into a collective trauma that shaped post-war politics and memory in profound and sometimes contradictory ways. The aftermath of Okinawa created an acute humanitarian crisis and a long-term political headache because devastated communities needed reconstruction and truth. Okinawan survivors sought recognition and reparations, while central authorities in Tokyo and Washington negotiated the broader terms of occupation and alliance. Those negotiations were haunted by images and narratives from the battle, which were used selectively by politicians to support competing visions of national identity and responsibility. Okinawa's legacy extended beyond immediate post-war reconstruction, because the island became a symbol of the cost of militarism and the danger of total war being visited on civilians. Memorials rose across the island, and survivors told stories that challenged sanitized narratives of grand strategy and noble sacrifice. Those personal testimonies forced societies to reckon with uncomfortable truth about the conduct of war and the limits of military necessity. The presence of U.S. military bases in Okinawa after the war added a new layer of complexity, because occupation and strategic value continued to shape local realities. Bases brought economic benefits to some, but also social tensions, environmental damage, and political friction that have lasted for generations. Okinawa became a place where global geopolitics and local lives clashed under the same sun, creating a persistent dissonance between strategic necessity and community well-being. The island also changed how militaries thought about amphibious warfare, because planners could no longer imagine a quick beachhead turning into a swift victory. New doctrines emerged that emphasized prolonged suppression, more firepower, and complicated humanitarian logistical planning in tandem with combat planning. The lessons learned in blood on Okinawa informed doctrine for the rest of the 20th century and shaped how nations prepared for the possibility of fighting in complex, populated terrain. For historians, Okinawa is a case study in the ethical limits of warfare because it forces us to compare hypothetical futures with actual suffering experienced in the present. The island makes clear that decisions taken in conference rooms have cascading, tangible effects on ordinary people and soldiers who will pay the price. That ethical pressure remains relevant today whenever societies consider weapons, tactics, or strategies that promise short-term gains at long-term moral costs. Okinawa also challenges the myth of clean wars because it demonstrates how modern conflict annihilates the boundaries between combatant and civilian, soldier, and neighbor. In the island's caves and graves, the neat moral categories that justify war dissolve into tangled narratives of survival, coercion, and desperation, recognizing that complexity does not simplify judgment, but it does demand honesty from those who retell the story and from those who make future policy choices. As the years turned into decades, Okinawa's memory became both a local wound and a global warning, because the island's violence illuminated the stakes of escalation. Politicians and generals used the memory tactically, while survivors used it to demand accountability and humane policy, creating a dialogue that never truly closed. That ongoing conversation reveals how memory can be mobilized to prevent recurrence, if societies are willing to listen and to act differently. There are technical lessons too, because Okinawa accelerated developments in combined arms tactics, naval defense systems, and logistics planning that shaped post-war militaries. Engineers redesigned ships and aircraft to better withstand suicide attacks, while ground forces refined approaches for clearing fortified terrain and protecting civilian populations. Those changes were pragmatic responses to a specific set of horrors, but they also altered the architecture of modern warfare in ways that endure. Okinawa's story is neither simple nor complete when we reduce it to statistics and strategic diagrams, because the island's real legacy lives in human stories and how they reshape collective imagination. Survivors, veterans, and descendants carry memories that complicate national myth-making and remind future generations that victory is never ethically cost-free. Those narratives are messy, contradictory, and essential because they prevent history from becoming merely a lesson of technique rather than a record of lived suffering. If we stand back and look at Okinawa, now decades later, we see a place rebuilt and yet haunted, a community that has reclaimed life while never forgetting its scars. The island has tourists, schools, and memorials, but it also hosts debates over militarization and sovereignty that trace directly back to those bloody months in 1945. In that sense, Okinawa is not a closed chapter, but an ongoing conversation about what societies owe their citizens in wartime and peacetime alike. The Typhoon of Steel metaphor captures not only the physical barrage of shells and bombs, but also the way momentum and fury can erase nuance and mercy. Okinawa was a storm in human terms, a concentrated eruption of violence that tested the limits of military theory and political responsibility. Remembering it means wrestling with the fact that strategy can easily become a moral blur when lives are treated as variables rather than ends in themselves. There is a bitter irony to Okinawa because the island showed what an invasion of Japan might be, and yet it did not stop mankind from choosing other horrendous means to end the war. The atomic bomb brought an instantaneous and incomprehensible form of destruction that solved the strategic problem in a way Okinawa had made painfully imaginable. That choice left ethical questions unresolved and created a new dawn of strategic possibilities that the world would wrestle with for generations. The lessons of Okinawa remain urgently relevant because contemporary conflicts still repeat the same tragic patterns of civilian harm, tactical expediency, and difficult moral calculus. Policymakers and militaries today should look at Okinawa not as ancient history, but as a cautionary case study in the limits of force and the unpredictable consequences of escalation. To ignore that history is to risk repeating its worst outcomes under different names and technologies. We should also remember Okinawa as a demand for humility, because the island revealed the hubris of assuming human costs can be neatly traded for strategic gain. Leaders often frame choices as purely technical, but Okinawa demonstrates that human suffering is not an accounting entry and cannot be fully justified by abstract objectives. That humility should shape how societies think about conflict deterrence and the technologies that promise decisive outcomes at tremendous moral expense. So what should we carry forward from Okinawa, beyond strategy and statistics, beyond doctrine and memorials, into the ethical life of nations and citizens? Perhaps the clearest lesson is that strategic calculations divorced from human empathy produce outcomes that are unpredictable, devastating, and often self-defeating. Recognizing the dignity of civilians and the real human consequences of military decisions must be central, not peripheral, to how we plan and how we fight. In the end, Okinawa asks us a question about the kind of world we want to build after the smoke clears. Because memory can be used for vengeance or reconciliation, and imagination can lead to repetition or reform. The island's history invites us to choose policies that protect civilians, invest in diplomacy, and refuse to see human life as a means to military ends. Those choices are harder than they sound because they require courage, restraint, and an insistence that war should always be the last, not the first, instrument of policy. If this exploration of the Typhoon of Steel gave you a new perspective on how history, strategy, and humanity collide, then remember that history is a teacher, not a sermon. Okinawa does not hand us easy answers, but it does offer a brutal, necessary lesson about the costs of escalation and the moral obligations of those who wage war. If you want more stories that unpack history and power in cinematic detail, hit subscribe and keep asking the hard questions with us.